It is a unique pleasure to be here because if I wasn't a historian, I would have been a librarian. I have also tremendous interest in expanding access to collections in Cuba, and at the University of Florida, have to say that the greatest supporters of that have been the curator of the Latin American collection and our dean of libraries who traveled with me to Cuba. So I do think there are many opportunities. My talk today is not about that per se. In some ways, it helps to give you background to ask the kinds of questions that you might not otherwise ask about the ability to speak, think, read, write freely in a setting that is often not conducive to that. So let me start with a joke. In the spring of 1996, during, and this is important, President Bill Clinton's years in the White House, a wildly popular joke circulated around Havana. The joke focused on a man, a Cuban man, who sets out late one night armed with a can of black spray paint that he finds outside his door. He is determined to write a large cartel, or graffiti, which is in fact illegal in Cuba. Anything that you were to write on a wall has to be approved by your local committee for the defense of the revolution. So this is a highly criminal act, and when he sees that there's a white wall right in front of his house with no graffiti, no approved, no nothing on it, he immediately says, "This is my chance." So seeing that no one is around, he pulls the can of paint from beneath his shirt and manages to write the word abajo, which means down with, on the wall without anyone being around, nobody noticing. Breathing a sigh of relief, he then completes the letter F next to the word abajo, right, down with F. And then suddenly, police car screeches to a halt right behind him, and he drops the can of spray paint, realizing he's about to be given a mandatory 2-year sentence for what he has just done. He gets this brilliant idea. And just then, the policeman begins to shout, "Compañero, ¿qué es lo que tú haces ahí? Comrade, what are you doing there?" He feigns total calmness, and he turns around and he says to the policeman, "Hey, you know, wait a second, man, I can never remember. Is it Flinton or is it Clinton?" Right? A few years after I first heard this joke, I myself encountered evidence of what it meant on a Havana street called Consejero Arango in a barrio known as El Cerro. It was August 14th, 2005, which is one day after Fidel Castro's birthday. On that day, all kinds of stuff happens in Cuba. As I was approaching the sign that I saw on the wall, it says "Viva Fidel," I knew there was something very funny about it. Apparently trying to save on plaster, the government agent charged with covering up what had originally been there did a very, very poor job. Hours later, after taking these photographs, which clearly showed that it originally said "Abajo Fidel," and not only does it say "Viva Fidel," but it also has no Committee for the Defense of the Revolution signature, which is what needs to be there. So there's all kinds of things that drew me to this sign, and it blew me away when I saw it. So hours later, I had a bunch of interviews with artists and friends, intellectuals. I showed this photograph on my digital camera to at least 25 people. Not one person, in fact, didn't get tremendously emotional in looking at it. Their eyes teared up. They zoomed in on it. And then they said, in many different ways, "La Cuba invisible se está dejando ver." The invisible side of Cuba is letting itself be seen. In many ways, this invisible side of Cuba is the real Cuba. It's the Cuba of everyday experience in Havana. It's the Cuba of protest and rebellion that we don't understand and we don't see because we choose not to understand it or to see it. We want it to take certain forms and certain conventions, which it doesn't take. This palimpsest of protest that I discovered that hot August day proved to be the first of several. In fact, I had already written an essay for a book of photographs in which the photographer had taken a similar picture, an American photographer, and neither of us realized that, in fact, it was exactly the same kind of graffiti in a completely different area of the country on a completely different occasion. Since medieval times, those of us who don't remember palimpsests, medieval times, palimpsests referred to the layering and inscribing of multiple texts with divergent, often conflicting meanings onto the same space, each one struggling to assert its own greater truth as a narrative. And I argue in this lecture and in my work more broadly that the struggle of Cuban citizens is one to subvert the overwhelming official narrative of the state, which is often the only one we hear, the only one we read, and the only one that we want to hear and read, because it's an easy narrative. The secret side of today's Cuba is one in which citizens are not passive victims of dictatorship, all desperate to come to the United States for material reasons. It is a place where you have a self-declared, self-styled form of rebellion that happens virtually everywhere. In fact, the greatest legacies of the Cuban Revolution are a culture and identity proudly anchored in the concept of free thought and opposition to the state, one which takes a number of forms. And in fact, the concept of struggle, la lucha, is a concept that gets integrated into the language. Probably there is no more common a response to the question, how are you, when articulated by a Cuban citizen, than aquí mijo en la lucha. Here I am in the struggle. La lucha is the struggle which is one that is based on the extreme austerity in which Cubans lived throughout most of the revolution, not just because of the US embargo, but also because of what Cubans call the internal embargo, which is the control that the Communist Party has exercised over individual economic exchange, at least until 1993, in a very, very severe way. Moreover, La Lucha has come to refer, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, in fact, to the kind of central axis of life, which is all about surviving simple tasks, domestic chores that you have to carry out in the absence of electricity or in the absence of what we might think of as a regular routine, because the state will cut your electricity or cut your water with no announcement whatsoever. And so you're getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning because you haven't had electricity for more than 20 hours, and you're washing potatoes and you are washing underwear. You are working at the same time. You're trying to get to work, and that in itself is a struggle. Everything is a struggle in Cuba. So in many ways, there is another phrase that has to be added to this, or the use of the phrase. Two more. One is that prostitutes in Cuba, which prior to the revolution were seen with disdain, and after the revolution virtually eliminated, prostitution was gone until, in fact, the early 90s, when it became a highly visible part of everyday life. And in fact, Cubans don't disdain prostitutes. It's a different kind of prostitution. It's freelance prostitution. It's not bordellos. It's not institutionalized. Anyone, in fact, could dedicate themselves to supplementing income if they needed to through this means. And what it's called is luchando un cliente, to struggle for a client. Luchando un cliente is what you often hear when somebody knocks on a door and is seeking to see a particular woman or a man in very poor areas of the city of Havana or elsewhere. And the person who receives you says, oh, she's not here, ella está luchando. She's out there struggling. And that in particular, luchando, in that context, reveals exactly what she's doing, or he's doing. The other thing is that Cubans pick their battles. They know which ones they can win. And that, I think, is also inscribed in the language. When you are upset, and you could be standing at a bus stop or on a bus, and you are upset about something that the state has done to you. You have been standing in line for more than 3 hours to get lemons, and suddenly there are no more lemons. There's no reason why, and you're due lemons that you were told, your ration is today. Or you go to get your uniform for your kids, and you don't get the number of uniforms you need, or you don't even get a new one, right? You get one with holes in it. And you're upset about this. Very often, a complete stranger will say to you, Mia, no cojas lucha. Dear one, or do not take up the struggle. Don't get involved with that. Life is too short. Don't let the state dominate it, right? Make it something else. So in many ways, I want to say before I cut to the chase and take us to Cuba, is that La Lucha, in so many respects, has defined what it means to be Cuban, and not just in the revolution, but long before that. In the 19th century, Cuba saw 3 revolutionary movements against the Spanish government, led by equal numbers of blacks and whites at a time when you didn't have an integrated army anywhere in the world. Cubans have always been deeply radical in what they have wanted and expected from the state. In the Republic until 1959, the Cubans saw 5 armed movements against a government that in different phases and different moments tended to put foreign interests before the interests of its own citizens. And each one of those was followed by U.S. military intervention. The only one that survived was that of 1959. And yet, ironically, for the last 5 decades, Fidel Castro's vision of what it takes to be and to survive the proximity of the United States has been the demand for unanimity, not unity. In fact, it's inscribed in the Cuban Constitution. Any meeting that you might have, whether it is of the Communist Party, the National Assembly, or one in your school, is not to end with a united vote. It's to end with a unanimous vote, and all votes must be unanimous, and there must be one line. Right? So unanimity has created an official public culture of acceptance and what Cubans call conformismo, conformism, But behind that is an extraordinary array of what I think of as guerrilla warfare against the state, to constantly take back public spaces, to take back public identities, to take back private spaces and make them into your own. So going to Cuba through this lecture and these various aspects of life there, I want to begins with a sense of what happened after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And one of the things that happens is that life got extraordinarily bad. The Cuban state in Havana stopped collecting garbage more than once every couple of months. Garbage came to dominate, and it still dominates, one's residential neighborhoods. If there are no tourists there, you will see mounds and mounds of garbage. And I can talk more about that later. But to be statistical about it, you also had, between 1989 and 1993, an import capacity that dropped 70%. Effectively, you also got such high negative rates of growth that they were unchartable. By 1992, Cuban economists at the University of Havana said that they were in perhaps the hundreds, negative 100% rates of growth, negative 300% rate. That's like shooting a country back to the 18th century. And effectively, that's what happened. People started having to make their own shoes. People had to start manufacturing things as simple as coffee pots in order to be able to continue to have some kind of normalcy. Food rations were reduced drastically. Meat rations utterly disappeared. I can tell you from my own experience of living in Cuba for 13 months without leaving in 1996 to 1998, that it would take you up to 4 hours to 5 hours to soften a pot of beans in which all you put was salt and 1 clove of garlic. And that's because the beans were so old. Cuba had no means by which to produce its own beans because collective farms had collapsed. The Cuban state controlled 90% of the land, and it was very, very unwilling to allow that land to be turned over because they knew that economic independence would mean the demise of a monopoly on power that the state has. And that is the primary lesson, in many ways, of this process. So disappearing acts, things just got extremely bad. And you certainly saw horse buggies being pulled out and renovated, being used by citizens at that point, unlicensed illegally, in order to transport people around the country. You also had the state unable and often unwilling to spend the few resources that it had on things like infrastructure, which it had not done for many decades. So it was illegal until 1993, for instance, for you to repair your own home. And then in 1993, you had to, if you were to do that, like for instance, if your plumbing collapsed, you had to get yourself on a list. You had to get the state to do the repair for you. Moreover, the actual structural buildings could not be repaired without that. So in 1993, to the great horror of the population, there was a reversal of the policy. It now became the citizens' responsibility to take care of the plumbing and the housing that had been in collapse for 40 years. So the kind of crisis that entailed, the shock to the system, was then supplemented by the shock of not having access to some things that Cubans think of as critical. Health products like soap. The ration of soap was reduced to 2 bars per year. And it's still 2 bars per year. People took to washing themselves in salt and vinegar, cucumber juice for your hair to try to lather it. The diet became so imbalanced in favor of sugar rice and these terrible beans that it produced a phenomenon called neuropathy that affected at least 325,000 Cubans, if not more. People lost their vision temporarily, partial paralysis. It was because in very poor countries like Guatemala, where you're eating a diet similar to that, you might be only eating beans, right? You have something that actually allows for your body to fix B12 and B6, which are in the beans, which is chili peppers or green peppers. At bottom that. And Cubans had none of those things. They didn't have peppers, they didn't have onions, they didn't have anything that would allow that to happen. So their bodies were not absorbing the vitamins necessary to function. This also produced a massive crisis, which is the Balsero crisis of 1994, where 45,575 rafters were rescued by the U.S. Coast Guard. They estimated, the U.S. Coast Guard, that at least 30,000 Cubans never made it. In many respects, nobody remembers this, but it was followed up with riots in August of 1994 for the first time under the revolution in Havana. And in many respects, the combination of all of these things produced and made it necessary for Cubans to become, on the one hand, ingenious in how they were to survive the policies and remedies of the state, and then how the state was to come up with ways to maintain itself through policies and remedies that otherwise it would never have embraced. So this is my uncle, and one of the things that happened was that he had a gas stove top, which he had had for 50 years. Most appliances in Cuba are over 50 years old. And he had, because there was no gas coming in for more than 3 or 4 months, they began to cook with first charcoal that he was hand making. A lot of Cubans had to do that. They spent about 2 years doing that. And then he and his son, those are his grandkids, he and his son came up with 2 ingenious ways to create stovetops. One is this ceramic coil that's at the top. And when there is electricity, you can heat that, and then you put it on a sheet of steel, which has been gotten on the black market from somebody who cut it out of his truck. Then you can use that to cook. When there is no electricity, there's an even better system that developed about 1994. Truck drivers were one of the few people who had really unlimited access to diesel fuel. So they began to sell that diesel fuel to Cubans. And this bottom stovetop, it was originally the front of a speaker system, a Soviet-issue Russian music speaker system, and they took out the front. And then he has crafted this little metal container where you put straight diesel and you light it. And in fact, the way that it's made, it will spread like a gas flame. It has a terrible smell, but you can cook. The Cuban state also developed means by which to make up for the absence of things like public transportation and get people going to work. So they created these 18-wheeler trucks, buses, that meant that, in fact, from 40, let's say 40 different lines that you might have taken all over Havana, now you only had maybe 8. Right? And these buses can hold up to 500 people. Cubans called them camels because they had 2 humps, right? But you can also see the size of them, right? The other thing that started to happen is that people started to steal. And not only to steal, but stealing things you would never imagine people stealing. Underwear. Number one thing that people would steal. No bras. I mean, there are no bras in Cuba to this day that are worth putting on, but there were many people who had no bras, they had no underwear, and you had to come up with underwear. And there was an illegal trafficking of stolen laundry. So you get this phenomenon of people getting relatives in Miami to send them resources, or this black market economy of creating this kind of gate around your apartment balcony. Some places just look like concentration camps. They have multiple. If you look at that one in the corner there, you see that there are multiple layers of cages, right? And here's another one. So these folks, they don't have, computers and stuff to steal. These pictures were taken from about 1999. What they have to steal is clothes that they might be putting out there, and then other things, shoes, pots. This is another example. Here you have somebody with a car who's probably a member of the Communist Party, and so he's got multiple layers of cage. And then, this place, which is a soap facility, storage facility, sorry that the image is off there, and that is one place that it's owned by the state that was constantly robbed, right? And so it has all kinds of cages. But there was another reality, which is that the Cuban state turned to a mixed economy in which they basically carried out a number of ideological reversals that nobody imagined. Certainly one of them was to adopt capitalism, and to govern the society, the economy, through the Communist Party. So you have a capitalist state that creates every possible law to facilitate foreign investment, for the creation of a tourist base, but also more importantly, and this is what most people don't know, the creation of free trade zones all over Havana. There are 8 free trade zones by 1996. These are places that are like maquiladoras, where you have Cuban workers who go and work. Unlike maquiladoras, the companies that invest there do not pay the workers directly. They pay the Cuban state, and they pay what they think of as a pittance, like $300 a month for 8 hours of labor a day by somebody who's a highly educated worker and is going to work hard. The Cuban state then would turn around and pay that person 300 pesos a month, which is the equivalent of, about $20. So $20 out of 300. Who's getting the rest? The Cuban state. Moreover, they would pay people with bags of items, things that most Cubans don't have, like deodorant, like soap. Cubans often who worked there often said they did this so that they would be presentable to the foreigners, because you don't want to have workers who smell, right? But they also get cooking oil. So where are Cubans going to be able to buy these things who aren't part of the free trade zones? They start buying them in state-owned stores where the same products manufactured in Cuba are resold to Cubans in hard currency, in US dollars. The US dollar became the national currency in 1993 of this real economy, which is the capitalist economy, and it remained so until 2004. I'll get to that in a minute. You also, however, because the state recognized that it could not afford to feed its citizens and it couldn't keep afloat 100% employment through the state, it allowed for the licensing of privately owned small businesses for the first time since 1968, when all of that had been destroyed. And you got at least, about 200,000 individuals licensed by June of 1996. Cuban economists estimated that for every self-employed licensed individual, you had at least 10 who were unlicensed and were selling directly to Cubans. And that's very significant. It wasn't just about selling, getting a license to create a small restaurant or a bed and breakfast. It was about repairing things openly, for instance, as you'll see. Also included the flourishing of prostitution, like this. But Cubans were extremely creative. People who had old libraries in their homes began to pressure the Cuban state to allow them in the high-traffic tourist areas with historic importance to be able to sell these books, old books. And so in Old Havana, you have libreros, and independent rare book dealers who sell. And then it's important to note that they will often be very highly educated historians or somebody who has graduated from the university and can't work in that profession because they can't survive on the salary they get. So if you are a Cuban and you try and buy these books, they charge you very little. It's if you're a foreigner that they charge hard currency, right? Then this is the kind of small-time repairman that became very significant to the creation of an internal domestic economy. People going and bringing their shoes for repair. The guy behind the shoe repairman is refilling lighters. So he goes to, as many like him would do, they go to hotels where they find canisters, empty canisters. And these are the kind of cleaning canisters or hairsprays that somebody would leave behind. And it says, please do not, whatever, be very careful about the actual gas that's inside, right? Don't try to take it out. Well, that's exactly what they do. They charge you 1 peso to refill your lighter. And that's important because there are no matches in Cuba. So you need to have lighters. And it's not to smoke, it's to actually light your stove, right? Or whatever you're using for cooking. So that's what he does. Then you got the people selling dogs, like by the late 90s, early 2000s, and seeking licenses to do so. Now, I do think that something very significant happened by 1997, which is that the economy was recovering, and it was largely recovering basically because of citizen entrepreneurs. The economy was growing at about 7% in 1996 to 1997. And the Cuban state was realizing, agencies of the Cuban state, that they just could not compete, not even with tourists, or rather for the tourist dollar, with citizen entrepreneurs. That foreigners always preferred to deal with a Cuban citizen entrepreneur. The quality of the service was better, the quality of the product was better, and they got to see and speak to somebody who wasn't going to give them the boring story they already knew before they got to Cuba. So in fact, many Cubans called this socialismo. And in fact, that was a dirty word. In the 60s, before the real Soviet age, and really you get a huge integration of Cuba and the Soviet market only in 1972. Prior to that, what you got was this extraordinary expansion of a black market that the state could not control. And entrepreneurship flourished under the revolution in the 60s. It was part of the research that I've done. So socialismo was the term coined at the time to describe that you relied on your buddies, not on the state, to actually do anything. If you're going to eat, if you're going to have a party, if you're going to anything. So this is the return of socialismo. This is what we get, and as a good thing. That's what people called it. And when you look at what the entrepreneurs were doing, you really know why foreigners preferred them. If you went to a hotel, a state-owned hotel, up until, in fact, I think 2011, and you ordered food, it was very unlikely that you would have any diversity at all. They give you this menu where the waiter, after giving it to you, would say, I want you to know that we don't really have anything that's available on, on the menu, right? You know, like my favorite example is there's a restaurant called El Conejito, which is called the Rabbit, right? And it was founded by Fidel in 1964. And the Conejito supposedly has 48 different dishes made out of rabbit. And you would go there, and they would say, well, they'd give you the menu, which is all entirely rabbit, and they'd say, we don't actually have any rabbit. Right? So what would they have? They would have boiled potatoes, white rice, and fried chicken. And that's basically all the state-owned facilities. Well, why was that the case? Well, first of all, everybody working in those state restaurants was pilfering everything they possibly could. If you got French fries, you would get a very small portion of French fries for which you'd be paying like $4 or $5. You would get watered-down ketchup because the ketchup was being adulterated. Half of the bottle was getting poured somewhere else. And the folks working in the state were using those materials to subsidize, or rather not subsidize, to float the real black market economy, as well as all of these licensed businesses. And then more significantly, Cubans wanted to participate in this new economy wholeheartedly with creativity. You can't do that. You know, there was, in Havana until 2008, when the Institute of Tourism changed things, you had one recipe for this cocktail called the mojito. No matter where you went, there was one way to drink it, and it was terrible, right? You know, because the state had virtually no access to real mint, so a lot to be said about that. So you went to a place like this, which is owned by a Cuban-Chinese ethnic society licensed to do this. It's like a co-op. And you would get this spectacular flash-roasted lobster with sweet and sour mango, papaya, parsley sauce, which you didn't even know was Cuban, and it would cost you $7. You went to a very top-of-the-line Cuban hotel, like the Hotel Nacional, or a foreign-owned joint venture, Media Coiba, and the same lobster with nothing on it, not even butter, would cost you $25, and it was a plain lobster tail. Then you had whole towns like Casilda, which had not been able since 1965 to do what they had done for hundreds of years, which is to fish lobster. The Soviets also never ate lobster, so lobsters are radically underfished in Cuba. The average lobster tail is about 2 to 3 pounds. And the reason for that is that because lobsters were so underfished, they're actually fished at the time in their life cycle when they should be fished. We in the United States have basically overfished lobsters to such a degree that we are eating at most a 14-year-old lobster. Lobsters are not sexually mature until they're about 36 because they live to be 60, right? So when you're eating a Cuban lobster, you're eating this 36-year-old to 40-year-old lobster tail that is spectacular in flavor. No one in Cuba understands the concept of boiling shells to make a sauce. Like all you do is you make the sauce, and the last, minute or two, you put your chopped lobster tail in there and it infuses it with a spectacular taste. So Casilda is a place near Trinidad, which is a 17th century World Heritage Site town, where I spent many weeks on different programs that I created at Bates College, at Yale, to study the legacies of slavery and the legacies of slavery. And Casilda is a town where 100% of people were dedicated to lobster fishing. You go to this town with your 22 students, as in this case, you knock on the door of anybody, And you say, first you act like you know that person, right? And all the students are like waiting on a bus, or they've just come from the beach or something. No, we don't do that in Cuba because that's touristic activity that would be criminalized under Office of Foreign Assets Control. So no, they weren't at the beach. But you go up and you knock on the door. The person who answers the door takes you right in. And you say, I got these kids. I want to eat. What time? How much? And that right there is what these two kids are going to share. It not only comes with, and it's huge. I mean, there are 2 lobster tails there that have been filleted for them. Costs $6 a person. It comes with rice and beans. It comes with mango. And the best of all is it comes with the Cuban conversation, because at least 10 families, when you have 22, will get together to make this happen. So this kind of economy was horrifying. It's still horrifying to the state. It's uncontrollable, and it also solidifies personal relationships with one another in which the state is not involved. And you have to be involved. That was the goal of the revolution. You needed to have a relationship with the revolution, which was mediated and produced through your relationship with the state, by being an activist, by going to rallies, by learning the lessons that the state would teach you. So what you just saw back there is a beautiful state-owned hotel. It's almost always empty, and because the food is so bad. And this was taken in 2011. Paladar La Colonial is almost always packed, but this is 11 in the morning. So state communism became seen in Cuba as doble moral, double morality. The hypocrisy of a state that said for 30 years, Cuba is for the Cubans and not for the foreigners, became a state where Cuba was for the foreigners, and as Cubans saw it, Fidel. Many times people would say, aquí hay un solo dueño, right? So you would complain about something at a restaurant, and the students often did that. They would ask people, like, why is there no light bulb in the hallway in front of the bathroom? And the guy who is like the head of the restaurant would go and find a light bulb and come over and screw it in, right? So that the student could go, or the others could go to the bathroom. And the explanation for why they do this: first, they get almost no light bulbs from the state. Secondly, people don't have light bulbs in their home sufficiently to produce the light they need, so they steal them. And third, porque aquí un solo dueño. There's only one owner here, and we have to make sure that we satisfy the owner. So that meant, too, that until 2009, no Cuban could stay in a Cuban state-owned or foreign-owned hotel overnight. You couldn't. It was illegal, even if you could pay for it. So that meant you couldn't, as myself, a U.S.-born Cuban, take my family to a hotel. It also meant that if you were like me and young, and I'm not young anymore, so it doesn't happen, thank God. But for a good 13 years of my 18 years of going to Cuba, every time I walked into a hotel, I'd be stopped at the door by the guards, asked for my ID, which I never gave them, and it was assumed that I was there because I was a prostitute. And the better dressed I was, the more nerdy I was, the more likely I was doing that. Right? So things like my LL Bean backpack, my smock dress, and my Tiva sandals gave me away as somebody who could not possibly have had access to that unless she was a whore, right? And women in Cuba came to understand that because they were treated constantly like this, that the state saw them all as whores. If you were a certain age, and that's the word they use, so forgive me for using it, right? But to me, that was the most traumatizing part of my life in Cuba. And I have gone more than 45 times, and of those 45 times, 40 were before 2009. So this was a very difficult situation, made no better by the Bush-era policies. In 2001, when he became president, there was a turnover and a lag in the imposition of what were radical reversals in state policies of the U.S. with regard to travel to Cuba. I'm sure you're all very familiar with them, but there's one thing to be said that I think is less spoken about. And that is that in May of 2004, well, there are two things to be said. When the new policies came in, the Bush administration created what was called the Commission for Assistance to a Free Cuba, which suddenly, for the first time in decades, made it official that what we were interested in doing was subversion through a federal program that provided $200 million largely to exile organizations in Miami who would develop supposedly relationships with usually handfuls of Cubans in Cuba. And there came with it a 183-page manual, I think it's 183 pages, that read like an occupation manual and showed just how utterly ignorant both the Bush administration and the exiled politicians who aided in the creation of the manual and the policy were. For instance, it promised that one of the first things that the U.S. government would do in assisting the new Cuba would be to vaccinate all the children. And of course, the Cuban government put up these huge billboards that said, "Muchas gracias, Presidente Bush," or "Señor Bush, pero ya estamos vacunados," right? Thank you, President Bush, but all of us are vaccinated, right? They have been vaccinated since 1960, right? Was one of the great things of the revolution, the access to vaccinations. So, without saying too much more here, I mean, what I want to say is that the thing was that the Cubans had a huge reaction to this. On the one hand, opposition leaders in Cuba 201 opposed it. They pointed out that Cuban congressmen in the United States were what they had always been, representatives of the United States and not representatives of island Cubans. And they said that for the second thing that one needs to say about the Bush era. When the Bush administration carried these policies out, and it became clear that you were not going to get hundreds of thousands of foreign visitors coming to Cuba, you could no longer send money more than once. You couldn't visit more than once every 4 years originally. It later was reduced to once every 4 months. You couldn't send more than $75 or $100 every quarter of the year if you had family in Cuba. All of the academic exchange programs disappeared. My own did. All the travel agencies that sponsored travel to Cuba disappeared. Bush gave a monopoly to one, Mar Azul in Miami, one exit location, and one company that could make money, right? So when all that happened, the Cuban government said, my God, we need to monopolize as much as we can all the hard currency coming into this country because we're going to go broke. And they did that very radically. In May of 2004, when I was in Cuba with the same 22 students you just saw, we were in Trinidad, and we were horrified that for a 7-day week, for 7 days, the Cuban government shut down all of the state-owned stores. This is where Cubans are buying their soap, that's where they're buying their oil, etc. And in that week, they changed the prices. They increased the prices 75% in many cases. 50% minimal. So something like a liter of oil, vegetable oil, went from costing $1.81 to costing almost $3, $2.83. This made Cubans poorer. And it was a deliberate policy, so many Cubans on the island said. Moreover, in the fall of 2004, the Cuban government, let me point out this because, you know, the irony, of course, is as things got worse and the prices got higher and more expensive, the government then started painting on the outsides of many of these stores, and this is one outside of Havana near Tarara Beach, slogans like this, for a always socialist marketplace. And nothing inside that store is sold in the currency in which you are paid. It's sold in hard currency, and it's manufactured in Cuba. So then that was followed up by the creation of this CUC. People called them chavitos after Hugo Chavez because he was supplementing, not really floating in many respects through oil subsidies, the state. So what happened? The chavito, the CUC, replaced the U.S. The dollar as the national currency of the capitalist sector with this thing which was worth 82 U.S. cents. So you get 82 cents for every U.S. dollar you spend. So if you go there, as soon as you get to the airport, this is still true, you give $1,000 to the currency exchange guy, and he gives you $800 back. Right? So suddenly the Cuban internal currency is worth more than not just the U.S. dollar, but euros. And this helped the economy because for at least 2 years, as people adjusted, the Cuban state got a boon. Now what has happened is, in many respects, and I know, many economists argue this, that has receded. Now there's no benefit. In fact, people are trying to spend less because they lose so much money going there. But in the end, Cubans who had access to dollars, any way they had them, were now 18% poorer. Then the state really clamped down on the licensing. In 1999, I had a list of more than 60 small restaurants, paladares, in Havana. By 2004, 2 remained. through a number of means: taxation, which increased, also zoning laws. If you had a restaurant or a bed and breakfast within 900 feet of a foreign joint venture or a state-owned hotel or similar restaurant facility, you could not have the bed and breakfast. You could not have the restaurant. And then the licensing fees increased the closer your restaurant or bed and breakfast was to something competed with the state. The idea is you cannot compete with the state, because when you do so, you win, right? So in the end, what you got as well was the effort on the state, and this part I love, to try to confuse tourists and even Cubans into thinking they're buying something from a Cuban when they're not. They're buying it from the state by imitating citizen entrepreneurs. So here you have the real deal. You have a Cuban-owned American car sitting out in front of El Parque Nacional Hotel, which is in Central Park. And this guy is going to charge you per person to take you out to Pinar del Rio the equivalent of $5 US, right? Then you have here small privately owned lunch kiosks. You'll notice the color of the people who are selling. And that's, in fact, one of the means by which Cubans, would know whether it was a privately owned thing or a state-owned thing, because the state prefers to hire whites. So when you look at what the state does, on the other side, this is directly in front of Parque Central, around the corner from the private. The privately owned taxi cannot park, nor can he solicit clients in front of hotels. He has to be to the side, which always makes foreigners feel kind of creepy, because you know that you're being approached from around the corner. Now, what's the difference between this car and the privately owned car? There's a label on it, which you may or may not see, and he's going to charge you $100 per person to take you to Pinar del Rio. Then you have the government-owned little lunch kiosks. And you can see the difference in the color. You can see the location is central, as opposed to on the side. So the end of the golden age is what we got in 2004. The state took back the tourist and service market really until 2010, when, in many respects, its own inability to make as much as they thought they needed to, and the blowback that the Cubans, regardless of not having licenses, regardless of all the risks that were involved, eventually returned in mass to participation in a black market that couldn't be controlled. So Raul, who was by then in power, had been in power for 3 years, made some changes. And I'll say one more thing. The one part of the capitalist sector that the state could not afford to repress, because it couldn't replace it, were the legalized agricultural cooperatives and peasant markets that had been there since and flourishing since 1993. And this is my cousin, by the way, Rigoberto. I'm selling the best mangoes in the world. And there's no way a state-owned farm can produce the quality of products that small farms can. It's the difference between a kind of Walmart corporate farm and an organic farm. So Cubans, nonetheless, turned to seeing the end of the golden age and the new regime that followed under Raul as one in which certain things were just simply not allowed. And as you'll see, this is a good example of it, that Cuba was kept barefoot and pregnant as a strategy of rule. And so the inauguration of this new period came with something no one expected. This very wildly popular outside of Cuba process and policy of demanding that Cubans replace their old inefficient light bulbs, which they had struggled, of course, to buy in state-owned stores for US dollars, with these, which they didn't get for free. So there was a roundup, door to door, by committees of the Defense of the Revolution in 2005 to 2006 to get everybody to turn over these bulbs. And then in addition, they turned to the refrigerators. And you don't touch a refrigerator in Cuba because that has become a family member. They were all 47 to 50 years old. And, you know, these refrigerators they have to be weekly cleaned. A lot of people give them names. Cubans were made to voluntarily give up all the old appliances, refrigerators, Soviet-made spectacular air conditioners. I mean, if they were made in the Soviet Union, it's going to be 50 degrees in less than 20 seconds when you turn that sucker on, right? Who knows what you're breathing, right? But you don't care because it's so hot. So all of this suddenly had to be turned over to the state. And you were forced to buy a new refrigerator that was bought in mass from China, a new air conditioner and a new fan, and you were set up on a system of payments that was just extraordinary. It was draconian. For example, the average refrigerator purchased by a citizen from the state cost 6,000 Cuban pesos, which is the equivalent of only $250. It tells you the quality of what they're getting. That's not going to last 50 years, right? For what everybody said. The 4% interest rate was fine, but this was the fear. Like, our refrigerator's 50 years old, this new thing from China, $250. And the money payments were extracted directly from Cuban workers' salaries. And it's still the case that about 85% of the Cuban population works for the state. So no Cuban had the right to refuse this. And artists made quite a point. In fact, this was shut down at the Biennale in 2006 when they did it. Artists made quite a point of the trauma. General Electric, right, is one of the most common labels of refrigerators in Cuba. So here you have two artists saluting General Electrico, right, which is what you called in Spanish, your refrigerator. They painted it olive green. And then it's significant that one of the most popular shirts you can bring to Cuba is a Gap shirt, because Gap, they have no idea, or many people don't know that it's a company, but they think it's just some kind of part of US popular culture. Gap, it refers to the gap between the image and the reality of life in Cuba. The gap between the state and what the state allows you to do and be. The other one that's very popular, if you can get one, is mind the gap, right? Which is that London, phrase you hear when you're on the train. Let me move quickly so we can get to questions. So Cubans had to acquire new rice cookers. They had to give up their electric hot plates and stoves. A lot of people simply buried them. My uncle made sure to put them away because he knew, I'm not going to have electricity to run this new thing. I'm not going to have it. So I need to have my diesel fuel. But the extraordinary sights here of just hundreds and hundreds of thousands of these refrigerators being rounded up. People cried. Throughout the course of the special period, education and healthcare have been the primary sufferers of the state's neglect. And the reality is that undoubtedly the teaching profession has been hemorrhaged of hundreds of thousands of teachers. You get the consolidation of schools because they don't have enough people to serve them. In 2000, a law was passed prohibiting anyone working in either the healthcare sector or the educational profession from abandoning that job and moving directly to self-employment, because that's what everybody was doing. In fact, private schools exist in Cuba, in people's homes. So you go to your regular state school where you have a terrible teacher. And you have a terrible teacher in part because many, many thousands of teachers were trained between 2004 and 2014 who were very young, who were 16 years old. They're called maestros emergentes. And if you're lucky, you get one of them. If you're more typically the case, that you have this live teacher who's very young, and then you have a television through which you receive your lessons. Math, science, language. Televised education is what the majority of Cuban students in elementary school and middle school are experiencing today. And we're not talking about that here. Today, 58% of the island's youth under the age of 14, or rather, between the ages of 10 and 14, are neither working nor studying, according to the Cuban government. I want to talk about Raul's reforms. Raul, when he came to power in 2006, issued a number of statements and made a number of moves that really frightened people, continue to do so. Raul is the most hated of Cuban officials in many respects because he was the mastermind of the most repressive periods of Cuban history. The creation of UMAP camps in the 1960s, the labor regime by which you were to be politically rehabilitated beyond these kinds of camps, which were mostly for intellectuals and homosexuals. The use of involuntary labor as a means for punishing people who were members of the Communist Party or members of the Communist Youth, who were intellectuals, who were revolutionaries. that was standard practice throughout the late 60s through the 80s. And in fact, that's a principal part of this book, Visions of Power, that I've written. But when he came to power, not only did he have that background, he immediately purged the Council of State of the two guys that people thought of as the most liberal. Carlos Laje, who was the architect of the capitalist reforms, and who was also most aware of how they should be expanded in ways that would have helped Cuban citizens participate in the economy and not be seen as immediate competitors with the state. So he was put under house arrest, thrown out of the party. People don't know where he is. Also, Felipe Pérez Roque, who is Minister of Foreign Relations. And there are others. He replaced these folks, including the vice president, his first vice president, with intelligence officials and military officers. Ramiro Valdés, former chief of Cuban state security, became Raul's first vice president. And these two guys spent the next few years making statements that were terrifying. One was that Raul in 2009 characterized the already drastically reduced rations in Cuba as, quote, a millionaire subsidy that had to be eliminated. Ramiro Valdés said, quote, we have to get the masses to participate more fully in the solution of their problems, of their own problems. They should not expect Papá Estado, Daddy State, to come and solve everything for them as if they were baby birds. Open your mouth and here is your bit of food, unquote. Cubans found comments like this on national television as horrifying as they were insulting, because this was a condition and a system created by these people. It's not their fault. What happened in April of 2011 was that the Cuban Communist Party met and issued a number of new lines of action. One is the elimination of all government rations eventually. 500,000 Cuban workers were laid off from the state. Massive layoffs are to continue and have continued. The idea being that the Cuban government would expand possibilities for self-employment in ways that they had refused to do in the past. And in fact, they have done that. New options for self-employment have emerged. However, the problem with this is that they're all in consumption and producing goods and services, and people don't have goods and services, or rather money, to buy those goods and services. So the idea that these government jobs would be replaced with the private sector as so long as the situation remains as it is not viable. So what is emerging in Cuba, as I will describe in the next 5 minutes and then I'll end, is that most of Raul's economic reforms are not designed to democratize access to the state-regulated capitalist market. On the contrary, they are designed to enrich and embolden an elite class of communist autocrats and their military allies based on a neoliberal model of development that has already been tried and tested and produced similar results in Latin America. There's nothing new about this. What is new in Cuba is that we have a very different socialist dictatorship of the left becoming a traditional military oligarchical dictatorship. So let me start with the new jobs, and then I'll give you a sense for how that's happening. So you do have the legalization of this kind of thing, welding, which had not been legal, and that became legal, and you have people picking up scrap metal and doing this. You have, now folks being able to give rides to children, on donkeys. That's illegal. I mean, the kind of wild expansion of opportunities for self-employment has increased. Also, Raul has made it possible for middlemen to exist. So if you, in the past, under the new capitalist reforms of the 90s, if you were going to sell agricultural products in markets designated for you to do so, they were highly restricted markets, there were locations. Same was true of artisans. You had to be the producer of that, or married to, or a family member of. No middlemen. And that makes it very difficult, right, to get the products out. Now that's no longer the case. Now you have a whole class of middlemen who buy stuff and then sell them. And you also can sell them all over. You don't have to be in a particularly designated place. And that makes it more Cuban. I mean, we had fruit peddlers, until the late 1960s. And now you have them again, right? What I think is important is that by the fall of 2011, when I returned to Cuba after these reforms, I had never seen so much food available in the city of Havana, and so few Cubans able to afford it. I had also never seen the country the countryside emptied of food. Because if you are producing mangoes in the countryside, you know that you can get it to Havana and sell more of them and for a higher price in the cities. But let me talk about the real kind of amazing undercurrent of reform, or amazing, I would say, the relevance of the reforms that has been largely ignored. All of the folks who run the foreign joint ventures are, all the CEOs, we could call them, or chief financial officers, are all military generals in Cuba. And those who weren't were replaced by military officers under Raul. Now, these folks don't have a lot of money, a lot of place to put their money. And they make hundreds of thousands of dollars. They make millions of dollars. And they're fearful, I think, as most Cubans do on the island, I would argue, that if they put it in a Swiss bank account, they may not keep it. Right? So where do you put your money when you don't have a safe place to invest it? You put it in real estate. And that was the case, ironically, in the 1950s under Batista, the dictator, when the banking system was so corrupted by the mafia. People bought real estate under Batista. Now you have a very similar parallel, ironically. The enemies of Batista doing the same. In November of 2011, for the first time since '61, Cubans can now legally buy and sell property to each other, and most importantly, directly to foreigners. Many Cubans understood the legalization of real estate sales to benefit primarily two groups. First, Cubans with relatives abroad, who would potentially drop all their enmity with the Castro regime and become buddies of the Castro regime, based on this whole idea that they might get private property rights and they might, in fact, make money from investing in that. And we've seen that happen. If anybody's been reading the news, Fang Hul, who is the great heir of the largest Cuban and U.S. Sugar corporations in Cuba, has now become a very big player and a big ally of Raul's reforms. So it's like, corporate giants with other corporate giants, communist label, holding hands. The second group, most importantly, is about allowing the generals and top military officers who either run the state corporations in the free trade zones or have been the state's partners with foreigners in joint ventures to do something with their money. So they have made this money and they invest it in these locations. Now, if you look carefully at this series of slides, it's a good example of this. Plaza Vieja, before 2011. In Old Havana, unlike some other areas of Cuba, when historic conservation happened in the 90s, the historian of the city of Havana threw out everybody who was living in these residences. And many of them had been hotels occupied by slum dwellers after the revolution. So they threw them out. They gave them a piece of paper and a promise and sent them out to these asentamientos, these sort of camps outside of Havana. There was a holdout in this plaza. If you see carefully this that building, right? And if you go back, you can see it from the air. So this is one where everybody in the building refused to sign the papers. And there they were, the last of this extraordinary plaza. So when the state finished the renovations, these people who lived in that building did what everybody had done in the colonial period. They had very poor water service to their building, and many people thought it was deliberate. So they started washing their clothes and using the fountain in the middle of the plaza, right? So this has to be the only fountain in the world that has a 12-foot fence built around it. There it is. And there you see the building behind it. Then, I don't know how they did it, but in November 2011, after 2 years, I had been there in 2009 and took these pictures, had seen this whole thing happening since the 90s. Suddenly, they got them out. They got them out. And there was suddenly no fence. No Cubans, no fence. And this building that was so dilapidated is now this building. So what happened to the holdouts' old apartments? They were made into stylish condos selling for $1 million a piece to foreign buyers. So this is a nasty kind of gentrification because it's one that doesn't even happen on the open, right? And this is a communist state that says it's all about socialist principles and whatnot. So The decree legalizing home internet connections, in many respects, there's an easy answer, is another thing to say about that. The only way you can have a home internet connection now, and it is legal to have one, is if you buy it through the state, which monitors you. And you have to have the money to pay for it, because it's also in CUC. This is another means by which the elite could normalize their high, kind of roller lifestyle. And to end the story, we have now the creating of the two parts of the economy that are the most flourishing and they're state-controlled. One is to happen here with the port of Mariel. The Brazilians have invested $1 billion in this port. It will be deeper than any other port that might compete with it, controlled by the US. And there you're going to have a massive free trade zone. Also, the expanding of the marketing of Cuban professionals as contract labor abroad includes the doctors. Medical missions began with Hugo Chavez. And in fact, there's a kind of smoke and mirrors to the whole thing, because as medical missions and the payment largely by the Chavez administration and his successor of treatment for poor patients has happened through Cuban doctors in 21 countries. Cubans on the island have seen the loss of access to those very doctors and resources. Moreover, Cubans sit, and this is a good example of an artist contesting this. There's a statue of John Lennon put up in 2001 with glasses, and so he's doing a performance piece objecting to this. But Cuban doctors, in many respects, are a huge part of the new state economy. In exchange for 105,000 barrels of oil that arrive in Havana daily, Caracas pays for 44,000 Cuban medical specialists to work in Venezuela. The Cuban doctor, like the free trade zone worker, will only see $75 a month to $100 a month, while the Venezuelan government might be paying, or the Costa Rican or the Brazilian, to the Cuban government $1,000. But at least he gets that $75, he gets to put it into a bank account, and he gets to come back and not pay any taxes on it, and he can also import duty-free anything he wants, or she wants. On the other hand, many Cubans, including the doctors themselves, talk about this as a strategy for smashing dissent among a very radical, highly, in many respects, liberal sector that sees socialism as needing to fulfill at least the most basic of its promises, right, in Cuba. Cuban doctors are not allowed to go to those countries with their families. They go for as long as 2 years without ever being able to return to see their families, and their families can't go with them. Why? Because they would stay, right? So to end here, there is a new state security, or new security state under Raul. And I do have a real questioning in my mind of how the way in which Cubans in the past have worked to open up spaces close to them, how well they'll be able to do that now. There are cameras all over Havana. They're not in tourist areas alone. 6 blocks from the hotel Havana Libre, there's an agricultural market where only Cubans go. Why there would be a camera there, no one knows. There are now military checkpoints on all the highways, and those who get stopped are Cubans. And it's about intimidation. So let me show you an example to end the story and ask you for questions of what you get. You get this little piece of paper. You get stopped for no reason, right? Little piece of paper that says, this is an opportunity to reflect. Let's help guarantee the safety of our roads. So I think that one way to start the conversation would be to ask about libraries. Another is to talk about the return and flourishing of black culture and black identity in Cuba. And to think about how what we might be seeing in Cuba is much more meaningful the longer the discussion you would have with somebody who sees it all the time. Police harassment of male black Cubans who are seen as the most rebellious of all sectors in Cuba is something that no Cuban would deny. It is incredible. You could walk across Havana and see five times a day somebody being stopped, and they all fit the same profile. And Cubans have reacted to this, especially black Cubans, by rejecting, in very uncertain terms, the state as racist, and as anti-democratic. And so this hip-hop artist, Raul, one of the most surveilled, one of the least known to us in the US, is one of the most popular. And it's through these means, these new means, I think, music being one of them, that they reach out. So his T-shirt says it all. He also has a master's in psychology. So the hip-hop artists and the intellectuals who are leading new forms of opposition in Cuba are different than we might expect them to be. And they also create different forms of discussion and ways to discuss. And they have a very deep historical understanding of what's happened to them. So if anything, perhaps today's talk has been that, a way to understand the present by understanding it in relationship to the past. Thank you so much for your interest.